Looking at these surveys, the obvious question is what's going on? The hypothesis that I'm going to put forward today is that there's an anti-masculine bias that is seeped into the culture in the United States, which has led to the neglect of issues related to boys, men, and masculinity. And today we are seeing its consequences in men's mental health. A brief anecdote. On November 23rd, I joined LA Fitness. My primary interest was the sauna. On day one, I entered the sauna and it was packed. There were about 10 men, all in their 30s. And contrary to sauna etiquette, as some of you might know, which demands quiet, or at the most like soft conversation, there was an intense conversation going on. A young man with a prominent Jesus tattoo was speaking emphatically about how to seduce women. And the topic moved to why men should never get married. Some of the reasons not to marry included women not being able to be trusted, the financial risks of marriage, and the reality that marriage ends in divorce. One young man even said that his divorced father made him promise never to get married. At that point, I piped up and shared with the group in the sauna that I was married. The strangers held what I felt like was a spontaneous moment of silence for me. Then someone asked why I decided to get married. I said, well, I find life can be pretty lonely and difficult, and it helps to have someone by your side. The conversation then shifted away from seduction and became about loneliness. At one point, someone said, it's unusual to have such deep conversations in a sauna, to which someone else responded, this is how we get through the pain. My talk today seeks to understand this pain, not the pain of being in a hot sauna, but rather some of the pain associated with being a man in America today. There is broad-based concern for boys in America. Here is a brief, recent societal pulse check on how we are feeling about our boys. Parents, this was an article published in 2025, this year. Parents prefer daughters overwhelmingly. 41% of parents agree with the statement, I am worried about boys in the United States becoming successful adults. And 42% of parents are concerned about the resilience of their sons in the face of adversity. Looking at these surveys, the obvious question is what's going on? The hypothesis that I'm going to put forward today is that there's an anti-masculine bias that is seeped into the culture in the United States, which has led to the neglect of issues related to boys, men, and masculinity. And today we are seeing its consequences in men's mental health. The first order of business is to define a few critical terms and substantiate the premise of this talk, namely that there exists something we can refer to as anti-masculine aggression. The zero-sum hypothesis suggests that any gain for one group must come at the expense of another. For example, some people believe that supporting one demographic necessarily harms another. This assumption is often used to dismiss concerns about men. The argument is that concerns about men are merely a reaction to the progress of women. If this were true, we would expect men and women to have increasingly divergent views on male discrimination, or at the very least, for women's perceptions of male discrimination to remain unchanged as gender equality improves. However, the data does not support a zero-sum model at all. As you can see from the slide here, while women are experiencing unprecedented levels of opportunity, both men and women acknowledge that discrimination against men is rising. This suggests that concerns about men are not simply a backlash against women's progress, but rather a response to real and growing challenges faced by men. Our presentation today is largely about gender bias. The question is, how do we measure it? And this is how I'm going to be measuring gender bias, or I'm going to be talking about it today. So it's inequality of outcome in a population above and beyond what can be explained by average gender differences, average biological gender differences. An example of a non-biased gender difference would be the fact that men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. This finding seems consistent across time, geographical location, and is not easily changed through intervention. Therefore, it's fair to conclude that this difference in outcome is better explained by biological differences rather than by social expectations. However, where we draw the line between average biological differences and social pressures/expectations can be difficult to discern in certain cases. So, generally speaking, the biological differences between that, generally speaking, biological differences between men and women have certain consistent characteristics. And I have them laid out here on the slide. We have consistency across time, homogeneity globally, and minimal sensitivity to social intervention. However, when we observe inconsistencies over time, variations across cultures, or sensitivity to intervention, it suggests that the observed differences are not purely biological, but rather rather shaped by socialization or bias, cultural bias. One good example of this is that in the 19th century, women were believed to be intellectually inferior and unsuitable for rigorous academic work. However, following the Title IX Education Amendments in 1972, we saw a dramatic increase in women's college enrollment and graduation rates, indicating that sex differences in college completion prior to 1972 were not indicative of biological differences, rather negative societal biases about female intelligence. So here we get right into it. These are some of the most researched and compelling negative differences in outcomes for men in America today. Suicide, men die by suicide at approximately 4 times the rate of women in the United States. Drug overdoses, men experience overdose at approximately 3 times the rate of women in the United States. Education, men are 15% less likely to receive a bachelor's degree than women. And finally, employment, we're going to talk about today a little bit. Between 1950 to 2024, we've seen a 21% reduction in U.S. labor force in male U.S. labor force participation. As we will soon see, these outcomes are not best explained by biological differences. Rather, their existence and their increasing severity is indicative of a societal bias that we will further try to understand. There are other areas of concern as well that are not focused on in this presentation, including declines in sperm count and sperm concentration, reduced rates of marriage, fatherlessness, and shorter life expectancy for men across all age groups. And I imagine there are others that, again, are not going to be addressed here. This data, compiled by the American Institute for Boys and Men, led by Richard Reeves, is excellent, and I encourage everyone to take a look at his material if this topic is interesting to you. Regarding suicide rates, the male suicide rate in 2023 was roughly 23 deaths per 100,000, compared to roughly 6 deaths per 100,000 women. So this is a 4-fold difference, right? For men, it's 23 deaths per 100,000. For women, 6 for 100,000. Over time, the gap between men and women is increasing. This means that men are dying by suicide at increasingly higher rates than women. In 1972, men accounted for 71% of suicides, and this rose to 80% in 2023. This, as well as significantly smaller differences in the ratio of male to female suicide in different parts of the world, with the exception of Europe, indicate that social cultural influences are in part responsible for these worsening outcomes among men in the Western world, including America. In 2001, drug overdose accounted for roughly 10% of fatal injuries for men. By 2022, it was 32% of fatalities. Since 2001, male deaths from drug overdose have increased by a massive 573%. As you can see visually, the magnitude of outcome differences between men and women has gotten worse in the last 10 years. Again, pointing to an outcome that goes beyond biological differences and demands of us to look elsewhere in order to understand these worsening outcomes. This chart illustrates the way in which there are dramatically fewer young men in the labor force. This is obviously not the result of biology, and I believe this outcome in particular can have frightening secondary effects for young men and our society at large if not addressed. Finally, pre-1960, women accounted for 35% of college enrollment. The government then stepped in and through affirmative action improved the percentages of women in college in the years that followed. Today, men account for 37% of college enrollment, which means that the enrollment disparity has almost completely reversed itself. I think this difference in outcome is a major problem today, just as it was when women were underrepresented in college. And neglecting to address this outcome on behalf of men is a meaningful data point in the discussion about gender. It is also worth noting that men without a college degree are 20% less likely to be married than men with a college degree by the age of 40. which is a concerning stat for a whole host of reasons. And as you can see here on the slide, this cuts across all races and demographics. So it's men across all races are struggling with college enrollment.